This plant belongs to the same family as the flower that gives the world morphine. But you can brew the dried petals into a cup of tea, drink it before bed, and wake up the next day with no withdrawal, no dependence, and nothing you need to slowly step off of. It takes real pain down, and it quiets a mind that won't stop running at night. In 1890, a major American drug company sold it as a real painkiller, and for decades after that, doctors kept reaching for it whenever a patient needed something for pain or sleep. That changed in 1910, when the government decided that real medicine had to come out of a laboratory instead of a garden. The medical schools that had taught doctors how to use this plant started shutting down because of it. And once those schools were gone, the book that explained exactly how to prescribe the plant stopped getting printed, and by 1939, the entire medical tradition built around this plant simply disappeared. The plant itself never disappeared, though. It grows wild, for free, without anyone planting it, watering it, or tending it. And that means nobody could ever patent it, own it, or set its price. That, it turns out, is the real reason it vanished from medicine. That turns out to be the real reason it disappeared. There's a real good chance you've walked straight past this plant without knowing what you were looking at. Look for a low, silvery green plant with feathery, almost fern-like leaves, and a single cup-shaped flower sitting on top of each stem, usually bright orange or gold. The petals close up tight every evening and open back up the moment the sun hits them the next morning, and that's one of the easiest ways to know you've found the right one. If you've ever driven through California in the spring and seen a hillside glowing solid orange, you've already seen this plant by the thousands. You just never had a name for it. Its name is the California poppy. And there are 3 things about this plant that explain exactly how it went from sitting in a national drug catalog to being a roadside wildflower most people can't even identify. The third one is the reason this same pattern is still playing out today, with other plants, right now, and once you see it, you won't stop noticing it. My name is Toby Woodruff, and I come from a long line of people who knew exactly which plants would feed you and which ones would hurt you. My great-aunt Opal used to walk these ridges with me and make me press and label every single plant in a notebook before I was ever allowed to put one in my mouth. That's why I'm the right person to walk you through this. So let's get into it. The California poppy actually belongs to the same plant family as the opium poppy, which is the flower that gives the world morphine and heroin. The two of them are botanical cousins, and if you set them next to each other, you can genuinely see the family resemblance in the shape of the flower and the way the plant carries itself. The difference is what's inside. Opium poppies carry morphine and codeine, whereas the California poppy carries none of that whatsoever, not even a trace amount. It carries a completely different set of natural compounds instead, and those compounds work on the body in a far gentler way. They ease pain, they settle a racing or anxious mind, and they help bring on a natural kind of sleep, all without producing the chemical grip that makes opium so dangerous in the first place. You don't build a tolerance to it over time, and you don't wake up the next night needing a stronger dose to get the same effect out of it. That one difference between the two plants is really where this whole story starts, and it's the thread that runs through everything else you're about to hear. It genuinely helps to picture the two plants side by side, because the resemblance isn't subtle in the slightest. They share the same delicate, papery petal texture, and they both open toward the sun during the day and close back up again at night, which is a big part of why early botanists grouped them into the same family to begin with. Cut into an opium poppy seed pod, though, and you get that thick, milky substance that's the raw source of morphine, which has ended up shaping an enormous amount of modern medicine, for better and for worse. Cut into a California poppy the same way, and you'll find nothing like that at all. The chemistry inside the two plants simply went in different directions somewhere along the way, even though they share a common ancestor far back in botanical history. They're a bit like two cousins who grew up under the same family name, but ended up living completely different lives. The California poppy is just one of dozens of plants like this, plants growing wild and free that most people walk past every day without knowing what they are. If you want the full guide to identifying and safely using them, I've put everything into one book. You can scan the QR code, click the link in the description, or head to freefoodandmedicine.com to get your copy. It covers every plant you need to know, how to identify each one, and how to heal yourself and eat for free. Long before this flower ever had an English name, the native peoples of California already knew it intimately. They used the whole plant, the root, the leaf, and the petal, to ease pain, to calm restless children who wouldn't settle down at night, and to help grown adults fall asleep after a hard day's work. This wasn't a plant they stumbled onto by accident either. It was part of a body of knowledge that had been passed down and refined over generations, long before anyone in Europe had ever heard of California. When Spanish settlers eventually arrived and saw entire hillsides lit up bright orange in the afternoon sun, they gave the flower a name of their own, Copa de Oro, which translates to cup of gold. It's easy to see why that name stuck, because that's exactly what a hillside covered in these flowers looks like at the right time of day. The name we actually use today came along a bit later, and it came from a fairly unlikely source. In the early 1800s, a Russian scientific expedition sailed down the California coast, and on board was a young surgeon and naturalist named Johann Friedrich Eschscholtz. One of the botanists traveling with the expedition ended up naming the flower in his honor, which is why it still carries that tongue-twisting scientific name today, Eschscholtzia californica. Most people who have grown this flower in their own garden have no idea that name is even attached to it, let alone where it originally came from. For a real stretch of time, mainstream American medicine took this plant completely seriously, and it wasn't treated as some folk remedy sitting on the margins of the profession. In 1890, Parke-Davis, which was one of the most powerful pharmaceutical companies in the entire world at that point, listed the California poppy directly in their own catalog, right alongside their other medicines. Their own entry described it as an excellent soporific and analgesic, and above all, harmless. That wasn't some small-time herbalist making a claim to a handful of customers. That was a major national drug company, putting its own name and its own reputation behind a wild-growing flower, and telling doctors and pharmacists all across the country that this was medicine worth stocking on their shelves and recommending to their patients. It had real, serious backing from the doctors of that era, too. There was an entire branch of American medicine at the time built around plants exactly like this one, and the physicians who practiced it were known as the eclectic physicians. They weren't untrained herbalists working out of the back of a shop somewhere. They ran fully accredited medical colleges, they trained thousands of working doctors, and they wrote the reference books those same doctors carried with them in their bags and relied on out in the field. Two of the most respected names among them were Harvey Wickersham Felter and John Uri Lloyd, and together the two of them wrote King's American Dispensatory, which was one of the major medical reference texts of that entire era, sitting on shelves in doctors' offices right alongside the more conventional medical literature of the day. This wasn't some obscure pamphlet being passed around in secret either. It was a serious, comprehensive reference work that working physicians actually consulted when they were deciding how to treat a real patient sitting in front of them. In it, they described the California poppy as an analgesic and soporific without the dangers attending opiates, and they stated plainly, in their own words, that it quieted pain and brought on a calm, natural sleep. Think for a moment about what that actually meant for a working doctor back then. If a patient was in real, serious pain but couldn't tolerate opium for one reason or another, or if the doctor himself was worried about what opium might do to that particular patient over time, this was the plant he'd reach for instead. It was a real, functioning pain reliever that wouldn't leave the patient dependent on it once the pain had passed. It sat on pharmacy shelves next to everything else available at the time, fully documented and fully respected within the medical community. For a while, it genuinely looked like American medicine had stumbled onto something rare and valuable, which was a safe and reliable answer to one of its oldest and hardest problems, the problem of easing real pain without creating a new one in its place. That position seemed solid and secure at the time, but it wasn't, and this is the important part to understand. The California poppy didn't lose its medicine. It lost the people who stood behind it. In 1910, an educator named Abraham Flexner published a heavily funded report on the state of American medical education, and taken on its own, that report did accomplish some real good. It pushed medical schools across the country to build proper laboratories, and it managed to shut down a lot of the diploma mills that had been handing out medical degrees to people with barely any real training behind them. That same report also drew a hard, permanent line straight through the profession, though, because it argued that real medicine should rest entirely on what could be measured inside a laboratory and manufactured inside a factory. Plant-based traditions like the ones the eclectic physicians practiced, built up over years of direct bedside experience rather than test tube results, were judged by that new standard to have no place in the future of medicine at all. State licensing boards across the country fell in line with those new standards fairly quickly, and the standards themselves ended up favoring one particular kind of medicine over another in a very specific and consequential way. They favored the patentable pharmaceutical, meaning the kind of compound a company could synthesize in a laboratory, bottle up, and legally own outright, over a botanical remedy that anyone with a bit of land could grow for themselves. That distinction sits right at the center of this whole story, because you simply cannot patent a wildflower. The California poppy grows for free along the side of the road, and no company on earth was ever going to be able to corner it, brand it, or control what it sold for. A laboratory molecule, on the other hand, could be owned completely and sold for whatever price the market would bear, so naturally the money, the research funding, and the professional prestige all began flowing steadily toward those synthetic molecules instead. The plants themselves got left behind for one blunt reason, which was that there was nothing left in them for anyone to actually sell. By 1934, the head of the Eclectic Physicians' Own Professional Association admitted, in what reads today as an almost mournful statement, that they were facing a genuinely stark choice: either be absorbed entirely into the dominant corporate medical system that had grown up around them, or fold completely and disappear. And in 1939, the last eclectic medical school still standing in the entire country, based in Cincinnati, Ohio, graduated its final class of students and closed its doors for good. The medical tradition that had trained generations of doctors to trust and correctly use the California poppy simply stopped existing after that point. The plant itself never went anywhere, though. It kept growing exactly where it always had, on the same hillsides and in the same cracks along the same roads. What disappeared instead were the trained people who actually knew how to use it properly, and who carried the professional standing needed to keep prescribing it with any real authority behind them. For decades after that closure, the story basically ended right there and stayed there. The California poppy went back to being just a pretty roadside flower in the public imagination, and mainstream science moved on to other things without giving it much thought. Nobody was actively studying it, and nobody in a position of medical authority was recommending it to patients anymore. Eventually, though, the laboratory ended up circling back around to it on its own, almost by accident. In 1991, a team of French researchers published a study in the journal Plant Medica, and what they set out to do was actually test what those old eclectic doctors had been claiming about this plant for generations, using modern scientific methods. What they found was that an extract of the California poppy really did produce measurable sedative and calming effects in the body, which meant this old folk remedy had a real, testable scientific basis behind it the entire time. Later research building on that initial study helped explain exactly why this was happening, because it turned out the plant's natural compounds appear to act on the same calming system inside the brain that modern anti-anxiety medications are specifically designed to target, a system called the GABA system. Those same compounds also appear to work on the very same receptor that benzodiazepine sedatives bind to when a doctor prescribes them today. In plain terms, that means the plant isn't just masking discomfort or knocking someone out the way a heavy sedative might do, It's actually engaging a real, well-understood calming pathway inside the brain, the same pathway that an entire category of modern prescription drugs was built to target. That's a big part of why researchers found the old eclectic descriptions so interesting once they finally sat down and tested them properly, because the physicians who wrote King's American Dispensatory, over a century earlier, had essentially described the correct effect without ever having the tools to explain the mechanism behind it. Then in 2004, researchers went a step further and ran a proper, rigorous clinical trial, and the results were published in the journal Current Medical Research and Opinion. 264 patients dealing with mild to moderate anxiety took part in a double-blind, placebo-controlled study, which is about as scientifically rigorous as this kind of research tends to get. It's worth being precise on one point, though, because the treatment being tested in that trial wasn't California poppy taken entirely on its own. It was a fixed combination of California poppy, hawthorn, and magnesium, all taken together as a single formula. That specific combination outperformed the placebo at easing anxiety symptoms over a 3-month period. So the California poppy was really acting as part of a team in that particular trial, rather than carrying the whole result by itself. But it clearly earned its place on that team, and the researchers were careful to note its contribution to the overall effect. Today, that recognition has actually become official government policy in at least one country. Health Canada currently permits a California poppy product to be sold specifically as a mild sedative and as an aid for managing chronic pain, which means a modern government health authority is now formally signing off on very close to the same use that a major drug company catalog was openly describing all the way back in 1890. One honest note is worth pausing on before we move on, especially since a fair number of people watching this probably already take some kind of prescription medication themselves. Because this plant works on that same calming system in the brain as prescription sedatives and anxiety medications do, if you're already taking something in that category, you really should talk with your own doctor before adding this into the mix in any serious way. It's a gentle plant by any measure, but that doesn't mean it carries no weight at all, and that distinction is worth taking seriously rather than brushing past it. There's a strange kind of justice buried in the next part of this story, though, and it should actually make you smile a little. While the very institutions that had once vouched for the California poppy were shutting their doors for good, one by one, the plant itself was being honored by the very state it's named after. In 1903, California officially named it the state flower, and it has held that title for more than a century now without interruption. Every single April, it still puts on the exact same show it has always put on, the same one native peoples once watched unfold, long before any of this later history ever began. Whole hillsides turn a solid, brilliant gold, and in places like the Antelope Valley north of Los Angeles, the bloom becomes so massive and so overwhelming that people will actually drive for hours just to stand out in the middle of an endless field of orange and take it all in with their own eyes. There's a real chance you've already seen this flower yourself at some point in your life without ever knowing what it was, on the side of a highway, spread across a meadow, or printed on some old faded postcard of California from decades ago. That's really the strange, almost poetic twist sitting right at the center of this whole story. The patented laboratory drugs that ended up replacing plants like the California poppy have gone on to build their own long and complicated history since then, including an opioid crisis that has touched nearly every single family in this country in one way or another over the past few decades. That crisis grew directly out of the same system that pushed plants like this one off the shelf in the first place, a system built around ownership, patents, and profit, rather than around what actually helped a patient with the least amount of risk attached to it. Meanwhile, the gentle flower that careful, trained doctors once reached for instead, the one no company could ever own or control or price however it wanted, never actually went anywhere at all. It outlasted the very catalog that once praised it in print. It outlasted the medical colleges that studied it seriously and the professional associations that backed it with their own reputations. It's still out there right now, at this very moment, blooming for free every single spring, exactly the way it always has, whether anyone is paying attention to it or not. It was never really lost. We simply stopped recognizing it for what it was, generation after generation, until the knowledge slipped away from most people entirely. But you don't have to be one of those people anymore. The next time you drive past a hillside glowing orange in the spring, you'll know exactly what you're looking at, and exactly what your great-grandparents' doctors might have reached for. If this story hit you the way it hit me the first time I learned it, let me know in the comments, and tell me where you're watching from. I want to know how far this plant's story is reaching. I'll see you in the next video.